Good morning. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. Today is February the 8th, 2024, and I consider the discussion today to be a special event because it's a somewhat different event. We're taking a break from talking about immigration, tax, the intersection of these things, all of which we know from previous podcasts generally tend towards massive injustice. And as sort of, I think, an interesting interlude today, we are going to talk about the concept of compassionate justice, since that is clearly lacking in both the tax and immigration system. And in that context, I had the great fortune recently to meet the founders and the movers and shakers behind an organization called Compassionate Justice based in Toronto, who for years have hosted some amazing speakers to talk about this issue. Primarily, I think, related to how the prison system works and that, but probably as good. I think that the way a society treats its marginalized and those who are incarcerated tells us a great deal about the society as a whole. So it really is my distinct privilege, honor, pleasure to introduce to you today the movers and shakers behind the Compassionate Justice Organization, Dan Lang, Jim Black, and Ben Levin. And why don't we begin first with each of you introduce yourselves a little better and how you got involved in this great movement and how long, etc. So, Dan, shall we start with you?
Sure. How I got involved, this actually started in the basement of our church about 14 years ago. And Jim Black, who's with us as well, he and I were there at that particular evening. And from there, we decided to really develop the whole compassionate justice concept in the series. So Jim and myself are both, sort of in a sense, the driving founders of the series. So that's my story.
All right. Well, it sounds like the founding fathers,
Yeah.
fathers, and
Well,
the driving fathers.
could
Jim,
I jump in that connection?
absolutely.
Only to say that, Ben, we were there day one, and there was another party who came up with the idea and Lansing. So, in a way, we are standing on the shoulders of Gene Bruce, and I will say that G has been an important force in my life, now deceased, unfortunately, but which has also led to work with ex-offenders and becoming friends with and mentors of those who have been touched by the criminal justice system and are in need of help in some cases, but certainly in need of friendship. And so while compassionate justice focuses on education and an enlightened citizenry, we're also involved in a more flesh and blood way, in a more intimate way with these same people.
That's great. And Ben, how long have you been involved in this?
Oh, I'm a newcomer. I can't claim any credit whatsoever as being a founder. This was going along very well when I got involved. In fact, I started by going to a couple of the events at the church. And then it occurred to me to ask if they had some room or some need for another person to help. And that's how I got involved. That would be about 5 or 6 years ago, something like that.
So you're not a founder, but you're a clear driver.
Definitely a mover and shaker.
So a driver, a mover, a shaker. Well, this is really good. And for a number of years, I saw the ads in the Globe and Mail. We'll talk about that in a second. But I also have seen the ads and started going to them. And honestly, I encourage any and all people listening to this to attend some of these events because they are really, really first rate. The speakers have been and continue to be, I think, absolutely amazing. Former Chief Justice McLaughlin, I was there this year on April the 7th, in fact. Former Supreme Court of Canada, Rosalie Abella, will be speaking, who was the subject of a recent documentary, which was called what? What was the name of the documentary that just came out?
Something about Supreme Justice.
anyway, if somebody were to do
A great profile, not only of the substance of her contribution, but of her personality. And she and Irving Obella are one very interesting couple.
no, absolutely. But this gives you a sense of of not only, okay, I hope you can see the quality of the movers and shakers here, okay, but, the quality of the movers and shakers here has, managed to bring some tremendous speakers. And, I suppose that my interest in this to some extent was years ago when I was in law school. I had the opportunity to teach a couple of days a week at Joyceville Penitentiary. There was a community college. I think it was, at the time, I think it may have been called St. Lawrence Community.
It is.
It's
Yes.
still there under that name.
Yeah.
Okay. So they had some kind of a business program where a diploma was available to people who, satisfied a certain number of course completions. And I actually taught, incredibly, the law course, the business law course. And it was, for me, it was, I think an experience. I wouldn't go as far as say it changed my life, but I would say that it definitely gave me an awareness of a lot of stuff that I don't think I would have had absent that.
Yeah, John, let me sort of pick up on what you're saying too, because it's certainly interesting as to what got us involved in this area. And I'll go back to the time 14 years ago when we sat in the church basement and we had a presentation by Tony Dew. Now, Tony basically is the grandfather of criminology in Canada, incredibly knowledgeable in the whole field. And one of the basic things that he pointed out was that, the incidence of crime in this country has been going down for the past 20 to 30 years. And yet the incarceration rate has been going up steadily for the last 20 to 30 years. What is going on here? That's, I think, one of the things that really sort of, for myself anyways, really got me engaged as to what's really happening here in our justice system. And then there's another side of it too. That's sort of the head side of it. But there's also the heart side. We had a fellow named Gordy come in, and Gordy was probably in his mid late 50s, early 60s at that point. And Gordy had spent the better part of his life in and out of jail from the age of 16 on. And I was so impressed with him. He was incredibly honest. He didn't blame anybody for his life, his existence. He took full responsibility for it. And, as I sat and listened to Gordy, and I really liked him, I said to myself, but there for the grace of God could go any of us, and that really hit me, because prior to that, those of us who are not involved in this world, we look at people who have been incarcerated. Well, they're criminals. They're bad people. They're the other, if you will, and yet, and this is subsequently proven true for me anyways, as I met more and more people who've been through, the criminal justice experience, and you realize they're good people just like the rest of us. They're no different.
To that point, there's some quite interesting research on how many people have actually committed an act which could have landed them with a prison sentence. And these studies show that that's typically 75 to 80% of any group of people you might meet. So had things gone differently for them, any of those people could have had a criminal record. And in fact, something like 4 million adult Canadians do have a criminal record, which, when you think about it, is about 1 in 8 adults in the country. So that means you're very likely to know more than one person, several people who have criminal records, whether they've disclosed that to you or not.
Yes.
Criminality, as we define it in the law, is very, very common. It's not the exception. It's actually the rule.
Well, as I remember the first time I was exposed to a criminal law class, the question, what is a crime? And unfortunately, a crime in our world is anything the government defines as a crime without regard to its moral implications.
Yes.
And, that's a real problem, Jim.
And in that connection, John, some of the people we work with and see and become close friends with have been in the wrong place, wrong time, made wrong decisions, obviously, and take responsibility for it, and are being judged by the worst thing they ever did. And that and with the criminal record, that looms and haunts them for the balance of their life. And when they come out without necessarily much help or much correction activity, they are lost and frightened quite often, and well, and have no friends. The family may have abandoned them. They continue to consort with the same people that put them in the first place.
I think there's that aspect to it. I mean, I remember my reaction, to my experience being in a classroom was that, to me, they seemed like everybody else I knew. It's just they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, coupled with, very, very weak literacy skills, right? That are sort of needed to survive in this world. And I had no sense at all that they were bad people. I mean, I really did not. And in many ways, I thought they were better people, and a lot of people were not incarcerated.
And don't underestimate them, John. Part of a writing group of ex-offenders, and consistently, without exception, they are brilliant writers and brilliant minds. And what a pleasure it is, and an honor just to be part of that circle.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
We know quite a bit about the kinds of people who end up in our prison system. Generally poor, often visible minorities, people with low education levels, large number of people with substance abuse issues, and a very large number of people with mental health disorders.
And trauma that traces back to their youth.
Yeah. There are some people, I don't think we can ignore the fact that there are some people around who are dangerous. But that is a small number of people compared to the 35,000 or so that we have locked up in this country on any given day.
Well, which raises the question, which I think to some extent brings all four of us together, is why is the solution to this mass incarceration?
And a significant portion, Ben, perhaps you can give us some numbers, that the significant portion of that total you cited are in remand, awaiting.
Yes.
They aren't charged, in fact.
They're charged, but they haven't been.
I'm charged, but not tried. Yes.
Yes. And in relation, in the provincial jails, about 70% of people in provincial jail in Canada have not been found guilty. They're awaiting trial, or they're awaiting a bail hearing, or they're awaiting something. And of those, about half, nearly half, will not be convicted of anything either in the long run. That we know that as well.
I mean, I've been out of this, from a professional way for many, many years, but I thought that presumptively they were supposed to be released. They weren't supposed to be held.
Yes, we have 3 Supreme Court decisions now in Canada saying the system is too reluctant to give bail. But then we have what happened last year with the provincial premiers and the police chiefs all saying, we're giving bail out way too easily, and the media running endless stories about it, and the federal government introducing a bill to make bail harder to get. And this comes back to your earlier question, John, about why do we rely on this? My own answer to this is that criminal justice is a world, I spent a lot of my life in public policy. Criminal justice is a world that is particularly driven by emotion, and it's particularly driven by the emotions of fear, anger, and disgust. And those are very powerful emotions. They do not lead people to want to sit down, look at the facts, and think through what the best responses might be. They lead people to want to lash out. So I think our criminal justice system and the laws that you correctly point out drive it. That's driven by people's fear, which is often stoked for political purposes.
And uninformed often.
Yes.
Often. Always.
Yes.
Yeah.
John, one of our speakers along the way was the distinguished Roy McMurtry, Chief Justice of Ontario, and a friend of the program. And he had an ongoing interest in an informed citizenry. He said that a justice system doesn't work if it's embedded in a citizenry that is uninformed or uninterested, in fact. So he spent a lot of his waking hours building that, with his own judicial institution or education institute, and I would say we are sort of part of that same desire or need to, in fact, create a more educated, informed, and mature audience that can understand the terms. And none of us will understand them fully, but the more engaged we are, the more likely we will understand what those issues are. And that's why people show up at our session in significant numbers. And those who do show up are stakeholders and do have informed opinions.
I don't know how anybody could, spend a Sunday afternoon or midday Sunday attending one of your sessions and, come away with a sense that, hey, this is an important issue and, it'd be good to, get this front and center generally in society. I mean, what I find amazing about it, I'm just speaking more practically for a minute. This is my sort of complete detached. I don't care about anything but the economic side. It is so expensive to keep people locked. I mean, it's beyond insane. With these governments running huge deficits and this, that, and the other thing. If taxpayers understood how much this was actually costing them to keep this going, I would have to think that might be a factor here. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but that is definitely a factor here. The cost.
John, let me talk to that too. To put some numbers to that, having a woman incarcerated for a year is, I think, about, and Ben, correct me on this one, but I think it's about $230,000 a year. And to have a man incarcerated for a year, I think is about $140,000 a year in that neighborhood. And for all that money that is invested in keeping people in jail, the system does very little to help them rehabilitate or get back on their feet once they get out. So we've got a system that's hugely ineffective in helping people recover. And at the same time, you look at the alternatives. Well, instead of being in jail, someone could be in a halfway house with, counselor support at 1/3 of the cost of keeping that person in jail. Why are we not facilitating the transition out of jail a lot earlier into a situation that would be a lot better for the actual individual in terms of them recovering and getting back into society? And we sit here and we spend huge amounts of money. I don't want to digress too much, but we're doing the same thing with healthcare here in Ontario. We're spending huge amounts of money to provide, through OHIP, care from the private sector. It's a huge waste of money. But sorry, that's a bit of an aside, so don't get me going.
I don't think it's an aside at all, and I'm waiting for Ben to jump in, with his comments on this.
Well, so the cost is clearly ridiculous. It would be far cheaper to send them all to Harvard and Stanford, frankly. It would cost half as much money. We'd save a lot of money. But obviously, the cost isn't the main driver. I want to come back to the point I made about this being driven by emotion. And we call it a justice system, but it's really a punishment and revenge system. That's really what it's about. It's about people who feel angered or hurt. And when humans feel anger or hurt, they want to lash out. And that's essentially what the criminal justice system mostly does.
And it always has. Right?
Oh, it used to be much worse. We need to remember that too. You can go back 100 or 200 years and, prison conditions were much worse. People could be put there for very arbitrary reasons. People were executed for stealing a loaf of bread. So in a way, we've modified it. It's vastly better than it was. It's just not nearly as what it should be.
One other dimension, Ben, there is what Aaron Dan is going to be speaking to February 18th, is that people are determined or judged to be criminally not responsible, or that they are assigned to a forensic institution, medical institution, without the benefit of a trial and can stay there indefinitely without ever having been charged.
Well, they've been charged, but they haven't been.
I mean, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Found guilty. Yes.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about NCR that I'm sure Aaron will talk about is that on average, people who are declared not criminally responsible due to mental illness end up spending more time locked up than people who are convicted or plead guilty.
Yes.
That's another point that we haven't touched on, which is that 90% of criminal cases that are resolved with a conviction are resolved through pleading guilty. So hardly anyone actually gets a trial. And the system is set up so that if you do choose to go to trial, you will be punished for it. If you lose, you will get a much longer sentence. The system only works because people don't exercise the right to trial. And if even 25% of the people who are accused of crimes chose to go to trial, the entire system would collapse completely. Because even with 8 to 10% going to trial, we can't cope and cases are being thrown out because we can't meet the timelines.
And if I were to add to what Ben's saying here, keep in mind, all those situations are settled out of court where someone pleads guilty and avoids the whole process of a trial, and they've got a reduced sentence. What the percentage of those people actually pleading that, even though they are not guilty? So in other words, people are willing to live with a lifetime label being criminal just to avoid the risk of going to court. And they're prepared to say that they're guilty when in fact they're not, because the alternative for them is so horrific, they're prepared to do that. It's tragic.
There are a number of reasons.
I agree with you completely. I mean, that is clear proof positive that this is in no way, shape, or form a justice system. It's sort of a conveyor belt, through which people go who've been accused of doing something that, really may not even in a moral sense be hugely, hugely blameworthy, right? I mean, I think that part of the problem here is that, there's so many laws, so many, there's just too much. It makes me wonder as I think about this, a great conversation here, but shouldn't there be, or maybe there already is, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time really thinking about this, but shouldn't there be a formally prescribed way of dealing with allegations of wrongdoing that must take place before this can possibly, the legal justice criminal law system can swoop down and, sting somebody?
Well, John, let me, to your point, one of our very first speakers was a fellow named Ted Ormston, and he was a judge, and he was a judge at Old City Hall. And so he trafficked all the cases that went through Old City Hall for years. And he noticed that so many of these cases were people, again, on the margins, down and out, had mental health issues, and yet were getting put right back into the system, ground out, back into prison again, in and out, just this endless circle. And so what Ted did, and again, this would be about 15, 20 years ago, he created a special court. And a lot of these cases, rather than going to the standard court procedure, they would go to the special court. And I think Ted actually was the judge in this court. And it was essentially a mental health court. It wasn't like a typical courtroom situation at all. The judge would sit down and talk with the person who was in the room, who had been charged with something, and try to understand really what was happening for that person's life. And in so many cases, the individual was having a real struggle with their life. And so the judge would work with that individual, say, well, if you're prepared to maybe see a social worker, over the next week and come back and see me in a week's time, we can arrange for that to happen.
Mhm.
Sure.
And so this type of process diverted people, into a system of support rather than a system of punishment. And it was incredibly successful. Interestingly, in Texas, where the prisons were becoming so expensive that literally the state was going bankrupt. And this was true. The state was going bankrupt. So finally, there was the dawning light that maybe we should do something other than throwing thousands of people into prison every day. And so they started the process that Ted Ormston did here in Toronto 20 years ago down in Texas, diverting a lot of these cases into a social support system that would help people get on their feet and not obviously. And this was so effective in Texas, they were able to shut down completely one private sector prison, which they had been paying an arm and a leg for. within 2 years of instituting this type of alternate process. I want to come back to a point that Ben made too. He said our system today is a lot better than it was 200 years ago when we would hang someone for stealing a loaf of bread. And that is true, but also the basic intent of the system hasn't changed in 200 years. It has not changed. It is still a system of retribution and punishment. And when people come out of it, they're in an awful place and they're dealing with huge social stigma.
And not,
And, if you look at the alternative, which, the indigenous approach, restorative justice, the intent of that is completely different. The intent of restorative justice is to actually help someone recognize the errors of their way, to take full accountability for it, deal with the person or persons they affected in committing their crime, and get them in a path of rehabilitation such that they will not do that again. Completely different set of objectives.
which is also intrinsic in the world of First Nations, that where restitution and restorative justice figures importantly. And we find ourselves, certainly in the West, with a disproportionate number of inmates, of both men and women, being Aboriginal folks who could much better be handled by their own restorative justice practices and legacies.
I'm not up on this particularly, but I have a memory trace that the sentencing guidelines have been amended to include consideration of that. Am I right on that, Ben?
Yes, that's what's called Gladue.
Yes.
The problem with Gladue is that, like many of these things, like the 3 Supreme Court decisions on bail, is it's there on the record books, but it isn't there in practice. So there have now been several studies done showing how Gladue is working out in practice. And they show that it's very largely ignored or built into the bureaucratic process so that it doesn't really change too much what happens. So, for example, Gladue reports, the reports are written for certain prisoners, but now there's a whole industry of writing Gladue reports in certain parts of the country. And the people who write them are paid for it, of course. And so now the goal is to get the report written, but not necessarily really to know the prisoner or the situation, because that's going to take a lot more time. And whatever you're being paid for the report, your hourly rate is going to go down a lot. So you have all that kind of thing happening too, right? Gladue makes sense in principle. Although you would also want to say, why wouldn't you have an equivalent of Gladue for people, say, with mental health issues? Wouldn't it make sense that any extenuating factor?
Street and insular minorities, as Justice Stone in the American court once said. I mean, I think, obviously there are people in this world who are, by disposition, pretty nasty pieces of work. And, they enjoy that. They thrive on it. That's who they are. But that's clearly an extreme minority, the people caught into the system. And I do not believe that most people who, get caught up in the criminal justice system, they don't want to be. I mean, they're victims. They're victims of the system. And they're not the only victims, but I mean, they are victims of the system, I think.
Well, here's an interesting example of how this works, and it goes back to how the courts get clogged up. Nearly 1/4 of all the cases in criminal courts in Canada are what are called administrative justice charges. That is, people who violated their bail or their probation conditions. But we also know that courts tend to be set way too many bail and parole conditions. So, for example, you might get a bail condition or a probation or parole condition that says you can't consume alcohol. And that is taken to mean you cannot be in a place that serves alcohol. So if you are in a bar with friends, even though you're not drinking, you can be arrested and charged for violating your parole. Now you've got a new criminal offense, even though you didn't actually do anything that was criminal in the eyes of most people. And now you've got another, and that's about 25% of all the court cases. So if you take the very famous case of Ashley Smith, the young woman who killed herself in prison, she started out with a very minor charge. And then because she was recalcitrant and didn't want to behave the ways the system wanted, she ended up with an endless string of violation of conditions charges. I think 17 of them, something like that. And so for a charge that might have kept her in jail for 15 days, she was there for years and ended up killing herself. And all because of these piling on one thing after another, often for things that weren't actually crimes had anybody else done them.
It's incredible. And I mean, that is a really serious problem, right? It reminds me a little bit. I saw in the United States, I think last week, some new law that's gotten through the House, but is going to the Senate. Anybody who's not a U.S. citizen who's convicted on drinking and driving charge is going to be deported.
Mm-hmm.
This is, this is the type of thing that I think unfairly singles out a lot of different people. But anyway, I think there's too many laws. Okay. Basically, you want to reduce crime, you get rid of the laws. Okay. You want to reduce bail violations, you reduce the number of conditions.
Absolutely. But let's look again at the politics around this. So like 10 or 15 years ago, a prisoner named, I think it was Rick Sauvé, challenged the rule that didn't allow prisoners to vote in federal and provincial elections. This went to the Supreme Court, which said prisoners had the right to vote. In fact, the court said the only right prisoners lose is their right to personal liberty. All their other rights as citizens are preserved while they're prisoners, which also is very far from being the case of what actually happens. So the Sauvé decision has been observed by the prison system and the provincial jails. If you're in there, you can vote in provincial and federal elections. But the law, the criminal code piece that prohibited that, has never been changed.
Uh-huh.
No government has been willing to go back into Parliament and amend the criminal code to get rid of this provision that the Supreme Court has struck down.
And not even in one of these massive omnibus bills they put in at the end of every budget. Oh, by the way, here's something else.
So Ben, help me understand. The Supreme Court recognized the right.
Yeah.
There's been no change in the criminal code.
That's right.
So what is the real effect of prisoners who are now wishing to vote? Are they able to in an unconstrained way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So the law is being observed. My point is that governments are very reluctant to do what John is suggesting, which is to get rid of laws, even laws that have been struck down by the courts. If you look at the Liberals, when they were elected in 2015, their program had a lot of promises on criminal justice to get rid of mandatory minimums, to make it easier for people to get pardons, a variety of things that, in my view, I think in our collective view, would have been good measures. But they implemented basically none of them because it's just politically, you are going to get beat up for being soft on crime.
Yeah.
So it's just easier to leave it alone.
One of our speakers, Marie Hennon, spoke to that point with some force, that there's no political capital, no incentive for these people to actually make accommodations and to make it more humane and more corrective and rehabilitative. But there's no predisposition to even think about that.
Well, Ben makes the point, though, if I'm understanding correctly, that there's also the reluctance, to do this extends even in circumstances where the Supreme Court of Canada has said, enough is enough already, so to speak, right?
Absolutely. And, the bail example I gave was a good one.
Yeah. 3
Supreme Court decisions saying make bail easier to get, and a government bill that makes bail harder to get.
Yeah. It's really, really awful.
But it is driven by public perceptions and voter preferences.
Do you really think, here's each of your thoughts on this individually. Do you really think the public cares about this that much? Does anybody?
No.
It's interesting, John, we've taken the time over the years with all the audiences who come to our events and thinking this might be a reflection of the people who are actually interested in this area. Okay. Which is a fairly logical assumption. And what we've discovered over the years is the people who attend our events are people who either work in the system in some capacity, whether they're social workers, lawyers, police or enforcement officers of some form.
Aftercare people.
Somewhere they're involved in the system, or they're people whose families have had direct involvement with the system because one of their family members has been, through the system. In other words, all the people who are interested are not people who just should think, you think of what should have an interest in this. These are people who are basically stakeholders in the situation. That is our audience. And we'd love to get beyond that.
How does society, I guess we can start here since, we're all interested in this, obviously. How do you get people interested in this? Do you run a campaign? It could just as much be you or?
Well, I think, John, you have to start with where people are at and show it somehow that it's in their interest to support a change. So I'll give you an example of this. About a week ago, the Ontario Division of the John Howard Society released a report, a study they had done upon the situation that those people who've been discharged from jail and the difficulties of them getting back into the real world because of all the constraints on their existence. So one example is that, here we are in a time right now where employers are having a hard time finding good people to do work, right? At the same time, anytime someone who's been, through the system applies for a job, immediately employers go rushing and see this person got a criminal conviction and they're off the list. And yet, the track record of people who come out of the system who are looking for work, they have a hugely positive reliability factor in their performance. And so, and again, this is the self-interest of the employer. If you sort of get beyond rejecting people because they've had a criminal conviction and give them a fair chance, you're going to find you're going to get good employees.
And
so that's an example, John, of talking to the self-interest of the employers as a basis for making a change, around how someone who's been through the system is treated. An example could be, again, along those lines, that after 7 years after release from prison, not only should they be not described as a record suspension, which Harper introduced, it should be described as a pardon, which is much more powerful. And secondly, we should be considering that after a certain number of years of someone being crime-free, as it were, maybe it's a 7-year period, then in fact, their record is completely expunged.
Now that is a really, really good and interesting idea. It makes so much sense to me. It's just like, are we really living in a world that is so vengeance driven that these things have to be a scar for life, especially for younger people? Ben, what's you're sort of the scholar of this sort of stuff, at least that's how I regard you. But has Dan's suggestion been considered at all?
Yes, Senator Kim Pate introduced a bill to that effect in the Senate a couple of years ago, but it did not get enough support to pass. There is some evidence on automatic expungement also in the US. Michigan has a program, I believe, of automatic expungement. What we find from these programs is that they are both much cheaper and much more effective than the pardon process. But, there's 500,000 people in Canada who have got a pardon at one point or another, and a tiny, tiny number of whom are eventually charged with another crime. But yes, the Conservatives made it much harder to get a pardon. And they changed the name. There is no pardon anymore, as Dan pointed out. But they're also much harder to get and much more expensive. This is another thing the Liberals promised to fix in 2015 and didn't.
Well, the problem with elections is they're about getting elected and not about doing anything good. Never shall the twain meet. But what's a pardon called now? Last I knew, it was a pardon.
It's called a record suspension.
Record suspension. Okay, so close my eyes. Record suspension. Yeah, pardon's a better word. No question about it.
Words mean a lot.
John, there is the collateral question: does time served in prison long or even longer, make Canada a safer society.
Well, that we actually have a lot of evidence about. There's a lot of studies of this in many parts of the world, and basically I've written a couple of blog posts about this, but basically the conclusion of the people reviewing this evidence is that at best, putting people in prison has no effect on their likelihood of committing another crime, and quite possibly it increases the probability of people committing additional crimes. It certainly does not reduce it.
What about, one of the things that each of you has said, not necessarily the same language, but the same theme, right? Is that, so that you spend some years incarcerated, and then there's this problem of getting back into society. And then, Dan was talking about the issue of employment, employers, stuff like that. Wouldn't it be better to give them all the opportunity to become plumbers and electricians? I'm serious.
But the federal system has essentially eliminated almost all its education and training over the last 10 or 15 years. I think, on your point, John, one small thing is this, that the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in this country are there for a relatively short period of time. So, most are in the provincial system, not the federal system, and they may be there 30 days or 60 days or, 20 weekends. The point about that is that 30 days in a provincial jail can have as damaging effect on the rest of your life as 10 years in a federal prison.
I think that's absolutely true. But I mean, regardless of the amount of time that, one is incarcerated, it would seem to me that the fact of incarceration should, I think, compel a consideration of training opportunities and that, to help people survive, out there in the world. And, we got this whole, I come back to plumbers and electricians probably because I always have trouble finding one to do anything for me. Okay. But, that aside, we have a clear shortage of people to do certain kinds of work. And, I think if you're going to put all this money, into keeping people incarcerated, that you would at the very least do something about, get some return on the investment,
Yeah, John, let me give you an example of that. In the States, Northwestern University teamed up with several of the prisons in their state. And in teaming up with the prisons, what they did is they provide the opportunity for prisoners who so wished that they could have the opportunity of having a undergraduate degree program available to them that would be provided to them in the prison, and they could actually graduate with an undergraduate degree out of Northwestern University.
That's great.
Well, guess what? It's worked.
Yeah.
And they had, I think about a year ago, they had their very first cohort of prisoners who actually graduated, and they were evaluated just as like every other student in terms of their work and the quality of their work. And it had a huge impact on those individuals. This can be done. It's not like this costs a lot of money.
On a smaller scale, it was being done, at least when I was at Queens and you were there, Dan. There were prisoners on day parole enrolled in degree programs. I got to know some, in fact, played in a jazz trio with a couple of them.
The federal government our federal government has essentially put an end to all of that in Canadian federal prisons. The only thing you can do in a Canadian federal prison in terms of education is get your high school equivalent, either your high school diploma or your equivalency, depending on which province you're in. Yeah. That's it.
What a total waste of, leaving aside humanitarian, total waste of taxpayer resources. That's incredible. I think that part of the key to this is, to get the general public to see how much they're being ripped off by this whole system.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John, you're right. I think, one of the ways of getting people's interest in this is showing the huge waste of taxpayers' money.
Yes.
That gets people. Because you'd like to think on basis of compassion, they might be interested, but let's be realistic.
Well, when was the last time any government of any political stripe in taking office or in campaigning for office said, we think the criminal justice system is a serious potential source of savings.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never heard any political party say that,
well, I think that's it.
even though it's true.
What if they did? I mean, I think that they might actually get a receptive audience on that. Yeah.
We should suggest that actually Pierre Poilievre, this would be a great way to save money.
Yes.
Because he's very keen on that.
There is one program called Circles of Support and Accountability that deals with ex-sex offenders. Circles support the outbound ex-offender, and they have a history now of 20 plus years. And the level of recidivism is just a fraction of what it otherwise would be when those individuals are in fact made a meaningful part of society and surrounded by reliable friends. And one can make a case there that every one of those success stories is worth $185,000 a year.
Right. No,
But to Jim's point on COSA, the federal government canceled the $1.5 million a year they were giving the organization.
There you go.
and this is so crazy. This has been a great and continues to be a great conversation. We're coming up to, close to an hour. And I'm wondering if I think we should continue the conversation with more podcasts and that discussions. But I wonder if it might be a good moment to tell listeners how they can learn more about compassion and justice, specifically about some of the upcoming events. So I don't know, Dan, it seems like that would be a good thing for you to comment.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a website that's easily accessible. But if you do search Compassion and Justice Toronto, I think you will find our website with all of the events there.
Past events too, right? They can see some.
Yeah, we've got a library. I mean, one thing I didn't mention in terms of the evolution of our speaker series is that we didn't have any money to do this. We weren't being supported by the church. It was under our own hat. But we went around and asked people if they would do this. And I thought, we'd have a lot of people who would be willing to do it unless we paid them somebody with a stipend. Every speaker, we've had close to 50 speakers. Every one of them were happy to do this with no compensation whatsoever.
These are
And these are not people who are needing sort of promotion of their brand. I mean, Beverly McLaughlin did not need promotion of her brand. Roy McMurtry did not need promotion. Murray Sinclair did not need promotion of his brand. I mean, these people did this because they saw this is the right thing to do. But anyways, yeah, I think if you're a Globe and Mail reader or if you read the Globe and Mail online, you'll see the ads there, both in print and digital. And if you want to have further information, Jim, I suggest you pass out your phone number.
It's at the bottom of the flyers. I will say that. Yeah, thank you. And I will refer them immediately to you, Dan. Okay. No, I'd be happy to speak to anybody.
Well,
Right.
the email address, actually, in all seriousness, compassionatejustice@outlook.com. Compassionatejustice@outlook.com. If you were to send an email there, somebody can, respond to that.
Yeah.
I set the email up in conjunction with this. Okay, I know you haven't done it before, but I thought this might arise. So compassionatejustice@outlook.com is where you could send off an inquiry if you like. But I got to tell you that, Dan has been doing this so long that I think he understands the importance of it, but I think he's forgotten what a fantastic job this, Dan and Jim and Ben have actually done. It's truly incredible. The speakers are absolutely amazing, unbelievable. And, I admire so much what has been accomplished, to your point, Dan, on no money. I mean, it just goes to show you that you can do an awful lot without getting funding from anywhere. And who knows, the funding could even be an impediment. So I would really encourage people to come out. The next one is February the 18th, and that is Toronto lawyer Aaron Dan, I believe.
Yeah.
And April 7th. I think they're all very special events, but an extra very special event. Retired Justice Rosalie Abella from the Supreme Court of Canada will be there. So, I mean, these are great opportunities, and you can get a lunch out of it as well.
Hey, a free lunch.
A free lunch. I've eaten them before.
Yeah, that's something we haven't mentioned, John. These events are all free, by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, yeah, I
Yeah.
would have gone to them anyway. I would have gone to them anyway. Okay.
Yeah, just
No, I'm just saying, the events are
By
free.
the way, John, talking to Rosie about her appearance, she made it quite clear that she was honored to be part of this ongoing program and series, and by the kind of company she was going to be keeping. So, we're obviously honored, but so was she apparently.
No, I think it's a tremendous group of organizers. I think it's a tremendous group of speakers. I just think it's, it really is a great thing. And it's the type of thing that is so, it's a necessary condition to beginning to get a rethinking of how taxpayers' money is spent. I put it that way because everybody relates to that.
By the way, the thrust for Rosie is that let's put justice at the service of law. No, let's put compassion at the service of law and justice.
I don't want us to finish, John, without, the three of us are here, but there's a whole bunch of other people who are also integrally involved in making these things happen. A number of other volunteers, some of whom have been doing this for a lot longer than I have. So, they're not on the panel today, but there's 6 or 7 other people whose names we could mention who are
Absolutely.
important.
I think they're all great. And, so you got all these people involved, and it's one of these great things in life where you've got a lot of good people, but the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts, I think also. And I don't know if you are comfortable mentioning any of them. It's up to you. But I mean, to be clear, there's a whole infrastructure that's deeply committed to this, right?
Well, John, I'd be happy to mention one individual who's made a major contribution, and the fellow's name is Philip Crowley. Now, Philip has been the CEO of the Globe Mail, just retired. He was the CEO for the Globe Mail for 25 years, probably one of the most highly respected journalists in Canada. And I noticed about 6 or 7 years ago, one of us noticed that he was actually a member of our church, but obviously he lapsed because I'd never seen him. So I sent him a little email, said, maybe you'd like to come to one of these events as a member of the church. He writes back, because I sent him the webpage that showed all our past speakers. And so he got a sense of the, quote, caliber of events we've been running. So he sends a note back, saying, would you like the support from the Globe Mail? And so, of course, I had to think about that for a few days. And I wrote, we'd be delighted.
Yes.
The Globe and Mail has provided us print advertising support for now, I'm going to say 5 years. They have given us over $500,000 of free advertising to support the series. And that all came about because Phil thought this was really worth supporting.
And many of those folks who show up are there because of that.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm pretty sure that my first awareness of this was through a Globe and Mail. And I'm pretty sure. But, once you attend one of these events and see the caliber, I think that you'll probably become a regular. That's my guess.
John, it might be worth noting that in addition to the presentation from the guest speaker, that is followed by a forum, if you will, a Q&A. And because of the quality of the people in the audience and their knowledgeability, that sometimes is the liveliest and sometimes the most enriching part of the experience. That if you come, you can be part of the exercise.
Absolutely, yeah. They're great. They're great enhancements, to the presentations on that. Okay. I want to thank all of you for your willingness to have this discussion with me today. This has been great. It's been interesting, but it's what I expected it would be, given what I know about you and the organization. So thank you for that. I would invite you to say a few words in closing. I think particularly with repeating again how people might get the coordinates and come to the events, and the next one specifically with Aaron Dan. Great. I don't know.
We also want to thank you for making this happen, John.
You're very welcome. I'm having a great time, so I even get that as a bonus. Yeah, so the next one is February the 18th at the United Church, 35, right? 35 Lytton Boulevard in Toronto. There's even free parking as well as a free lunch. Imagine that, free parking somewhere in Toronto. So come on out. I think it starts at 12:30. Is that correct?
That's right, John.
Okay, so you want to be there at 12 so you can eat. And then
Oh, at 11:45, the food will be laid out.
11:45 to eat. Okay, 11:45. But, you know, seriously, great thing. And April 7th, of course, Justice and Bella. Well, thank you very much. And again, if any of you have any closing thoughts, comments, anything you want to get into the podcast, I guess now's the moment. Otherwise,
Well, one last thing, John, I'd like to point out is with the free lunch, there's also Nanaimo bars.
Oh, you had to mention that.
okay. So in other words, we have enhanced free lunch.
It's an enhanced free lunch.
Yeah, no, the food's great. I will admit that I like the food too. Okay. All right, Ben, any closing thoughts?
I guess what I'd say is that, you know, the effort to change any of these kinds of public policies or systems is always a long-term thing. If we look at where it's happened, it's because people had sustained effort, many people from many places over a long period of time. That's the only way it happens.
You know, that's absolutely true, but it's all what it also means is the people who come out to these events and get involved necessarily become part of the
Yes.
process, right?
One of our committee folks who's been there for most of the time and has committed himself to helping those touched by the criminal justice system. He says, and I have appropriated the thought for myself, is that he says this has been the most authentic thing he has done in his life. And there is something truly authentic about the conversations and the issues that are being addressed.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, you're involved in something that actually makes a difference, you know, which is a great thing. Dan?
I ended on the Nanaimo bars, John.
Yeah.
All right. Good enough. Well, let's do
Thank-
one of these soon. And thanks very much, everybody. And again, this is
Thank you.
speaking with you
Thank
from Toronto, Canada. Today is February the 8th, 2024.
So we're